Hello, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today, this afternoon in the East Coast. And our guests are in California and Hawaii, so a little different time zone there. Thank you again for sharing some time with us today. We're super excited to have another opportunity to speak with customers of Mercury that Shelley has kindly arranged for us. We really enjoyed the experience of having some of the customers of Mercury. They've been hand selected by Shelley and her team, and so it's been, so far it's been an excellent choices. Shelley, thank you so much. We're going to be with you for about an hour today. We're going to be talking about Terraformation. I know that many of you were able to review the information in advance, but we're going to get into the weeds, so to speak, in the trees. I'm punning you. So just for the record, we can't hear or see you. We know you're there. If you care to ask a question, please feel free to do so as they come to mind, and post them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll make sure we get to as many as possible. We have a lot of people joining us today. So we're going to be recording this, and with permission from Terraformation, posting it on the Family Office Insights YouTube channel and/or the Arthur's Roundtable podcast, and hopefully on the Terraformation website, so you can learn more about them at the same time. So with that, please welcome Shelley. Shelley Gollin is a great friend and partner in this exciting webinar series. Shelley, thank you again.
Thanks, Arthur. I'll make it brief. This is probably not the first time some of you guys have heard me make this intro, but Mercury is a banking platform that is designed to meet the needs of businesses and startups. We are actually the #1 choice of YC Combinator companies, and we're right behind JPM as the #1 choice. Well, it's really #2 choice for startups across the entire ecosystem. I put this together with Arthur because I work as a senior director of relationship management with our high growth companies. And we're looking to find ways to both increase access to sources of capital to some of these incredibly innovative high growth companies that we see every day in our portfolio. And we're trying to create that access to build that towards family offices, H&WIs, and kind of your network by extension. So I think this is a really great step in that direction. Arthur's been a terrific partner. We also bank family offices, VCs, and we provide personal banking as well. Happy always to chat after this session.
Yeah, full disclosure, we're Family Office Insights is a happy and delighted customer. Can't say enough about ease of use and customer service and interface about Mercury. So full disclosure, we are actively using and enjoy using Mercury, as does Jonathan, who you'll meet in a minute, which is how this all came about. So Jonathan, please, welcome.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, Shelley. I'll do a quick intro. So I'm Jonathan. I'm our Chief Sustainability Officer and VP of Climate Impact at Terraformation. And I'm really excited to share what we do with you all today. Terraformation is a native reforestation company. So we restore native forests all throughout the world. In just the past few years, we restored about 1 million native trees, and we are in the process of reforesting about 30,000 acres back to their native glory with native species all throughout the world. The thing that really makes Terraformation special is the team, and I don't just mean the individuals, but also the breadth of expertise. So we've assembled a cross-disciplinary team. We're about 100 people all across the globe in countries like Togo, North America, Singapore, all over the world, really. And bringing together a breadth of operations, forestry, technology, science, and more, all blended together to tackle what we have seen to be an expansive and very complex problem. And I think, I like to say, I think you'd be hard pressed to find some other company where you'll see executives from Facebook and Uber working hand in hand with experts from the United Nations and NASA. So it's one of the things that's really unique about us. And at the same time, we're joined by some really amazing and foremost institutional angel investors. These people are ones who have been successful in their own right and believe in the power of capital markets to drive innovation and positive change in the world. And they've seen themselves do that firsthand. And if I leave you with anything today, like if you walk away from this with any takeaway, I really want it to be this. And it's that in 2009, a number of really prominent scientists got together and they created this framework called the planetary boundaries. Planetary boundaries describes the limits within which human life can remain stable, right? So there are 9 of them, and these are the different facets. And it's basic things: water, air, right? Biodiversity, our climate, etc. And last year, we actually exceeded our 6th planetary boundary, right? So 6 out of 9 of these essential needs that we have as a species have been exceeded on this planet. And I share that to convey how grateful I am to everybody that has taken the time to listen in today, and to reiterate that this is one of the most important problems of our generation, and your attention to it is really immense. In this, as we look at that problem, reforestation is really our best ally against solving those problems. It affects climate change, and it's known to be a very credible solution against that. But it also has a wealth of other benefits, from water purification, protection of biodiversity, ability to change our climate. And when we think about scale at Terraformation, we're really focused on finding the solution that has the longest possible runway and that ability to have the biggest impact. This chart here, right, shows how reforestation stacks up against every other nature-based carbon capture solution, which includes things like biochar and wetland restoration. And reforestation can capture 6 to 10 times more carbon than the next best solution. It also outpaces all the other climate solutions in terms of metrics like cost, right? So on a per dollar basis, a ton of CO2 sequestered. Trees are essentially the cheapest thing that you can do to remove CO2 from the air. So there's a whole bunch of different cool stats and things that we found, but we did our homework and we really tried to look at it holistically and figure out what is the most important thing that we can be working on to solve this really great challenge that we have that hits all of these different aspects that are important to humans.
Jonathan, I don't know where you plan to do this a little later or at some point, but it might be helpful whenever you feel comfortable in doing it, is to describe the objective. Is it to build a profitable business? Is it to just reforest the planet and capture CO2? Is it a combination of both? Just like the model, right?
Yeah. I think most organizations doing this type of work, and maybe the impression that most people in the audience would have, is that this is a nonprofit, right? You see organizations that you might donate to: Arbor Day, Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy. You might mail $20 to them, or your grandma mails them $20 in the mail. That's historically what people think of when they think of forestry. And one of the things that's changed, I would say, is that there are more companies now focused on how do we solve our climate, and recognizing that it's a problem that is affecting everybody. It's affecting governments, it's affecting corporations. And so, what we found is that there's a way to do this profitably. There are examples of companies that are doing this profitably and having a massive social impact. So I don't think these two things are incompatible. And if anything, I would say they're actually becoming more and more intertwined. Yeah. So
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, our goal is to really do both. We think that we can build one of the largest companies in the world, arguably, just because of how big the problem is. I mean, it literally affects every single person on this planet, and billions, if not trillions of dollars will be going into this space just on the nature side alone. Right, there are a number of reports done by some of the big 4 consulting firms, and JP Morgan, I think, and Goldman Sachs put something out there. But this whole space is expected to grow significantly in terms of capital into it. And so we see a very credible path to make a very large company, not just in terms of revenue, but also the number of people employed to do this work on the ground in all these different places. And we think it'll be a social good, which is why I think it'll be really relevant for the folks in the family office sector.
Yeah, no doubt. I think it's really instructive that not only is this a good idea, even if you don't really understand the science, it just seems logical that it makes sense. But what's happened, and I know some of the group have seen this, is that people have voted in a serious way up to, close to $70 million so far in your company. So some of the smartest people on this planet, and I'm promoting it this way because I'm impressed, right? You know, the people who have invested are not only interesting people and presumably smart, that they voted with their checkbooks in a meaningful way. So I think it's important for the audience to understand that this isn't a fledgling nonprofit. It's a well-funded uh, enterprise to solve this problem.
Yeah, thanks for calling that out, Arthur.
You bet.
I think this slide probably speaks to it pretty well, right? The size of the market is expected to get to 30 billion by 2030 and over $1 trillion in 2050. This number actually might even be higher now. You know, we are all, and I mean, we as in sort of the larger science community, you know, the policymakers are learning about this space as it goes. And I would say that every week that goes by, I hear a more dire outlook on, you know, the state of our climate, our ability to make a transition quickly enough. And so these markets may actually be growing even faster. You know, one way to think about this is, and I've heard other people tell me this, is it's not exactly correlated to what a traditional company might be correlated to. You know, in terms of carbon capture, our market is heavily correlated to how bad the climate gets to some degree, right? As the climate gets worse, as the need for reductions and removals becomes more important and more necessary and more recognized through policy and, you know, corporate contributions, carbon prices go up, which is good, right? I think we should be taxing carbon. We should be, you know, putting dollars in investment towards it. And so as the climate gets worse, carbon prices will continue to go up. And, you know, in a market with constrained supply, the one who owns a supply or is generating a lot of it is in a great position to succeed. So, yeah, a little bit fatalistic, but that's one way to think about, you know, how our market grows and the way in which we can meet it.
Totally makes sense.
If yeah, I think I often get asked about like, hey, you know, I have read some articles and I have a bad impression about carbon credits. And I think if anyone in the audience feels that way, I honestly don't blame you. The first generation of carbon projects, like the kind that have been written up in the news or, you know, on John Oliver or Stephen Colbert, you know, over the past couple of years, they've really highlighted, I think, real and honest structural issues with the carbon credits of the past. And I think it's worth noting that almost all of that controversy is aimed at conservation projects. And these types of carbon credits are being issued in exchange for not cutting down a forest. So apologies if I'm you know, sort of explaining the basics of the foundation, but I know this is a pretty complex space. But these carbon credits are ones that are issued for not cutting down a forest, right? We just pay people to leave it alone, which is incredibly important. But it does create this perverse incentive. And there's a lot of controversy around that. And sometimes people will do things that are just not, you know, sort of against nature. Terraformation does something different. So we only do reforestation, which means that we go into areas where trees have either been cut down, you know, they've been denuded. There's been, you know, either fire or illegal logging, right? Areas that used to have a forest historically, but that no longer have it. And we introduced the original trees that used to be back there, right? So we're not kicking people off of land. We're not creating this sort of perverse incentive. We're actually going in and just doing a restoration of what was originally there. And this is something that we've been committed to from the very beginning, the commitment to biodiversity, the commitment to native species. And so what's happening is we've actually found ourselves meeting the needs of what is now considered to be the second generation of carbon projects, right? So you're proving that the trees are actually sequestering new carbon from the atmosphere. That's really important to corporate buyers and really important to this market, is being able to prove that you're having a net positive impact. We're building in the community, right? They are part of it. We actually work with local communities on the ground first. And then what we create is a biodiverse native forest. We're not creating a monoculture plantation of eucalyptus trees, you know, in Idaho. We're actually creating the native species in that area. And then with that, we bring all the tools and technology that we as a company in our DNA have built up over time. This is what sets, you know, I would say the things that you might have read about or heard about in the past, you know, all of those issues, I think are still getting worked through, to be honest. But you know, a large majority of them do not apply to reforestation. A large portion of that is really focused on conservation projects. And so what we find, you know, everyone is racing to create, how do I create this new generation of forests, right? How do I get the second generation carbon credit? How do I invest in this new methodologies and these new standards and sort of this new bar that's been set? It's almost as if the playing field has been completely leveled and everyone has to run the race in the very beginning. And what we're finding is that in addition to the bar getting raised, there's just significant challenges and bottlenecks to get through. Financing, right? How do you find financing for these projects in the very beginning? It's really difficult. How do we create the infrastructure? Sometimes this is physical infrastructure, like homes and roads and things like that, which not only takes, a great collaboration with your financial partners, but also great collaboration with governments and communities. The one that we really honed in on is the lack of talent. You need to actually, in order to plant trees, this is a physical production. This is not atoms, right? This is not bits. We're not just writing code from our homes. We're actually physically planting trees out in the world, and you need well-trained staff, right, who can do this type of work repeatedly and consistently and report on it. That's one of the things I would say that's made Terraformation really different, is our ability to get in and be hands on the ground and train teams to be able to do this type of work. There's so many different stages of it, and just calling out here that over the first 5 or so years, a project goes from incredibly risky. This is a developing country investment, physical assets, right, that you're deploying overseas, and then you're creating sort of a virtual asset. You're not getting rights to actually own the land or anything under it. You're getting a virtual asset called a carbon credit. And so this is an incredibly risky investment. And over time, it becomes less risky. But being able to get through that first 5 years is very difficult, and not many people do it because of all these different complexities. What we've been able to do at Terraformation is solve for all of these bottlenecks at once. So we provide the financing, we help them create the infrastructure, which we actually build and design in-house. We train all of their talent and their teams on the ground. So these are, maybe farmers in local communities who've never done native reforestation before. We teach them how to care for native plants, choose the right species, those kinds of things. We walk them through the planting. We manage that remotely through all of our tools and technology. And then as they complete their project and make progress, we turn all that reporting back over to whoever's financing it, whether it's a corporate who wants an offtake agreement or some sort of net zero commitment, or it's a project financer, like maybe a large fund that invests in assets. And so we sort of facilitate that whole process for them. There aren't any companies that you'll be hard pressed to find any companies that are doing every single piece of that, which is important to get done all in concert in order to get a real financeable project, something that's bankable.
Is it fair to say, Jonathan, my perceptions, some others, that there was a lot of planting of trees, whether it's reforestation or, I guess it wouldn't be, not cutting down trees, but reforestation. And then the wheels came up because nobody took care of it, right? So the ongoing maintenance was not accounted for or financed for. And so the whole thing fell apart. There was a lot of that happened, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been, I think with good intentions, but there's, we like to talk about it internally about the real costs of planting trees. You might see programs or marketing campaigns that say that, it costs $1 to plant a tree, which is true. But maybe it costs another $10 or $20 or more to maintain that tree over its full life, right? Which might be 30 or 40 years. And what you don't want to happen is you don't want to pay some money, plant the tree, and then really 5 or 10 years later, it gets cut down, or maybe less, right? Maybe it just dies because it
dies. Yeah, right. Yeah.
All of the projects that we design are 40-year projects. So we budget for 40 years. We get land agreements and permits for 40 years. We plan for these projects to stand for a long time.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah, I don't want to dig too deep into this, right? But if you look at the number of teams, the number of new projects that are started every year, there's about 11. And of those 11 projects every year, there's about 7 unique teams. If you think about the parallel that we like to use, right? So think of Y Combinator. Y Combinator creates hundreds of teams, hundreds of new entrepreneurs and startups every single batch and every single year. And if you think about the innovation that happens in Silicon Valley and technology, I mean, just the number of even SaaS or B2B SaaS funds that are created outpaces this number. It just kind of shows the lack of innovation and sort of the lack of growth that we really do need to see in this type of market as well. This is the problem that we're trying to solve. To do that, we've created our own accelerator modeled after Y Combinator, and it's probably no surprise that we've got folks like Sam Altman and others, with Y Combinator backgrounds on our board and involved with the company. But we think that we can apply this same model to help scale reforestation solutions across the world. So we take an accelerator program, it's a multi-phase approach. We start with, call it 6 to 10 teams. We bring in, and these may be local NGOs or startups in developing countries. I like to think of them as sort of ecopreneurs who have been getting by with community fundraising, right? Maybe they've raised a couple $100,000 to, do a small pilot. Maybe they've been running a community forestry program, and we help them take it to the next level where they can start, accepting millions, if not tens of millions of dollars to run projects. And we do this in many batches. So we had a number of projects, for instance, in Africa that we just kicked off earlier this year. We've done projects in South America, in Southeast Asia, and we run these teams, call it 4 to 10 teams or so. We run them in concert together, and we teach them everything that they need to know.
Is there hundreds of those type of people out there struggling to do reforestation?
Yeah, so we've been pretty surprised by this. I mean, just on inbound applications alone, we get about 150 applicants every single time we run a batch. I think we're at almost 1,000 in our database who have raised their hand and said, hey, we're ready to start a reforestation project. Not all of them. I mean, just like YC, I think we've got like a 2% acceptance rate. So not all of them are going to be fit to do a project, but sometimes you can help them sort of get along. So maybe they'll be, they'll have land and they'll have a team, but maybe they don't have, the right species selected, or, maybe they need to work out and convince a local community nearby to give them access to land. So there's a whole spectrum, and our job is really to take them along that whole path all the way to the point where they can start accepting, again, tens of millions of dollars to run a project.
So even though you've raised a lot of money and you're doing 6 to 10 of these, there's not only room, but a demand for a lot more, right?
Yeah. One way to think about it, so there's Terraformation, sort of people call it the holding company, but there's our organization, which sort of oversees all of these individual batches, right? So it's like as if we're the Y Combinator, and then each individual startup could actually end up raising even more money than Terraformation has raised, right? If we raise $70 million, call it within 2 cohorts, we expect them to raise $100 million, because there's might be 5 or so teams underneath of that, and each of them raises 10 million bucks.
Yeah, and I don't want to race too far ahead, but the idea, aside from reforestation, is that organization or that location project is monetized through the carbon credits.
Yeah, that's right. That's one, and we're not exactly tied to carbon markets, but we found it to be the best financing vehicle that we have. Most of these projects do have multiple ways in which they bring in revenue. Some of it can be philanthropic grants or maybe government-sponsored programs, either through the US government or through their local governments. Some of it could be also other types of products. So think of sustainable timber, agroforestry, these other revenue streams. One of our projects actually in Ghana is the fishing community. And so they're rebuilding fishing ponds, and that's a source of revenue for the community. So there's multiple ways in which you can finance it. It's quite complex. But carbon is sort of the main thing that covers the CapEx for the projects as well as the operating capital, and then gives the community some room to grow. The other things that we sort of think of as beneficial, kind of the cherry on top for them to help give them a little bit of breathing room, and even out revenues. But for the most part, yeah, carbon is the main driver.
Yeah. Super interesting. Sounds awfully complex as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's complex. And I think it makes it a problem worth solving. Just like, some of the people I would say that have companies that are both mission aligned or mission driven and highly profitable. I mean, people point to Tesla, SpaceX, right? Those types of companies, they're solving really big and hard problems. And if you can solve it, if you can get on the other side of it, it could be very profitable as a business.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to run through this, but this is some of the ways in which we add a lot of value through the accelerator. Again, we solve through multiple stages of this, from financing and infrastructure and training and tracking. These are things that are very important to corporate buyers, right? That is, it's really difficult for me as a corporation to underwrite a, NGO or startup in Togo, but I might be willing to do that with support of a company like Terraformation, who's kind of guiding and facilitating it. We deploy capital, right? So if we get capital from a fund or from, a family office or from a corporate, we deploy capital in tranches. So as the teams show more progress, as they, get more confidence along through our accelerator, we concentrate capital on the winners. So you could think of it kind of like we do, the angel round, and we do the Series A, and we do the Series B, and then somebody else comes in, smaller Series Bs, right? But we do multiple stages of funding, and then someone comes in and adds, tens of millions of dollars into the project.
Yeah, so you get it investment ready.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Way, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, yeah, I mean, these projects are probably very difficult to finance from a traditional, investment criteria standpoint, and we help make them bankable for funds and family offices. We also put them together in different types of structures. So we might create an SPV for you. We might also create portfolios to give you diversification. So rather than getting all your carbon credits from, one country in Latin America, like one, like Colombia, one project, we can give you exposure to, call it 5 different climates, a bunch of different markets, different restoration types. So it could be mangrove restoration, which is a wetland restoration, plus a terrestrial restoration. We can mix all these different types together that you get that diversity, which is really difficult to get if you're looking at it on just a per project basis. Similar, a lot of parallels to real estate. I think if people in the group have been investing in real estate, it's a similar type of model where you'll find maybe a REIT or something like that who will give you diverse exposure, insulate you from maybe the volatility, and be a trusted advisor who you can always pick up the phone and call. That's our role as Terraformation, and we have development and capacity building on the ground. Some of the tools and technology we provide to some of these organizations are things like our modular seed bank. So it's a 40-foot shipping container, completely off-grid, uses solar panels on top and fire retardant batteries. And we've got about almost 20 of these deployed all throughout the world. I think we've stored, 70 million seeds or something like that through them now. But they're actively banking seeds for restoration work across Africa, across North America, all over the place.
Yeah, how did you find the talent for that? I mean, that's got to be a very niche, especially when it's idiosyncratic to the area, right? The particular trees and forestation and so forth. Was that talent out there?
The talent to build out seed banks?
Yes.
So we design all of the seed banks in-house. So our own staff, we've got about, I think, 15 people in product engineering and design. So we build out our own tools and technology. We design the seed banks. And then we actually find local partners in Uganda, for instance. We teach them how to build the seed banks to spec, and then they develop them, and then they can sell them essentially and deliver them locally. It's not easy. It's definitely not an easy process, but we try to do our best to make it, very simple instructions and something people can easily learn. And then in some cases in North America, we'll find somebody locally to build it, or in Hawaii, we actually built them ourselves for the first 5 or so, and then we deliver them throughout the islands. Yeah, they're super cool. I mean, just a real feat of engineering. We've got some really cool people working on those specs. And then what's really interesting too is being able to teach those same trades to other people throughout the world. So now they can actually build their own seed banks. They can make modifications and maintain them. Yeah, that's how we really try to build this platform. The seed banks are really cool. It's actually one of the things that we're pretty well known for. You might have heard us on NPR and some of these other areas covered for those seed banks, because it's a real bottleneck when it comes to restoration, and not a lot of people are talking about it. But once you get into the weeds of doing a project, a carbon project these days, you run into that issue really quickly. But it's not, that's not the main revenue driver for Terraformation. It's really a platform to get people to do restoration and to get to come to us to do restoration. And then on top of that, we layer in all these different ways in which we can help, which could be finance, could be training, could be tools and technology, right? All of which are monetizable for us.
And the sourcing of the right seeds for the right area, is that also a a skill that exists out there and you had to find those people that knew how to source those seeds? I mean, it's probably sounds complex.
Yeah, so what we typically find is that the locals know how to source seeds. They just may not know which ones are native or not native. Just because, there's historical literature that you need to look through just to figure out like, oh, that this thing actually, was it always here? Or did it just move in here the last 40 years or so? And so what we do is actually within our software, we tell people, hey, this is the list of the native species for your project site. And then they know where to go find those seeds and how to restore them. We also, we give them a companion app. So they take a mobile app, they go out in the field and they track whenever they collect those seeds. So, and this is a completely free app. There's tons of people all throughout the world using it. But they'll take this mobile app with them. They'll go out and they'll collect seeds and they'll track where they got it. And then they'll deposit that into our seed bank and we'll track that. And then when they take it out of the bank, just like you would take money out of an ATM, we track that point and it goes into a nursery, right? And they can grow it and then it goes out into the field. So what happens actually is we track, if you go into a tree at a Terraformation site and you look at a tree, we actually know every stage that tree went through. How long was it in the nursery? Before that, how long was it in the seed bank? Where was that seed actually collected and by whom? Right? And so we can track that whole genesis. I like to think of it like, tracking your Amazon package. You order something from Amazon and tells you, oh, it was, started over here in Oregon and then it went down into California and then it finally made, its way to your home in Kansas. Every step along the way, who touched it, where it was, what time. And so you can always go back and figure out like what's happening. For us, it makes the operations really easy because now we can feel confident that they know what seeds to collect and what native species to collect. But it also lets us intervene. So we can now remotely project manage, dozens and dozens of sites from, our home bases in Hawaii or North America or anywhere. And I know that they're on track and intervene when we think that they're starting to go off track. Maybe they don't have enough trees in their nursery to, meet their planting goals by the end of this year. Or maybe their survival rate in the seed bank, is really low because maybe they left the refrigerator door open. We can tell all of those things before they become very large and expensive problems, which nobody else can do.
Super cool. It's like seed provenance, right? It's like
Exactly. Yeah.
I love it.
Let's see here. I'm going to just skip over these, right? But we talked about the training a little bit. We talked about how many teams. I think this slide is outdated, but last I heard, I think we're at 850, almost 900 teams. So starting to approach about 1,000. And I think even this number of total land area, I think we're probably at around 20 million hectares of land that's in our database that's kind of waiting to be restored and dug into.
And how long have you been actively doing this in a meaningful way?
The accelerator is about 1.5 years old.
Wow.
So yeah, it's a very new program. I think there's just really strong demand for it out there. And again, nobody is doing this holistically. There are some people out there doing maybe just the training, especially nonprofits. There'll be nonprofits doing just the training. There are funds set up to do just the financing. There are technology companies set up to do maybe just the tracking or the software. But because none of them can bring it all together, you end up, having to piece together multiple different solutions. If I'm a fund and I invest in forestry projects, I'm making a binary choice. I either have to think this team is investable or not investable. And there's nobody, there to take, ends up being the bell curve, the 80% of projects that are on the line or in that gray area. How do I make those teams that are almost investable more investable, right? How can I tell them to go, hey, this is a really great company, and I'm Sequoia. How about you go and go through Y Combinator and come back to me? There's nothing like that exists today.
Yeah, super cool. Is the effort that Benioff announced a few years ago about planting 1 billion trees weaved into this, or is it separate, or is he committed to do it through you?
Yeah, so Benioff, so it's 1 trillion trees actually. The Trillion Trees Initiative. It's a lot of trees. That was actually, the idea from that came from this guy named Tom Crowther, runs a lab in Zurich. And his article, which was an article published in Nature, was the same inspiration. Mark's inspiration that came from him was the same inspiration that started Terraformation actually. So this idea that, hey, we can actually reforest the planet with 1 trillion trees. these are the different areas that we think we can do it in, and all of that math that went behind that was actually the thing that kicked off Terraformation as a real company focused on restoration. So yeah, and we work very closely with them as well.
Jonathan, can we take one question? There's a bunch of questions from the group. Can we take one from our dear friend Alfie, who Shelley had recently met? It's Alfie asks, are your restoration strategies regenerative?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of ways to interpret regenerative, but Alfie, feel free to chime in if you're thinking about it differently. There are ways in which you can regenerate things like soils. So I would say yes. Again, we're replanting native species there. So we regenerate the original soils there. It's not something like monocultures. We're not putting a bunch of fertilizer in there. And we're not doing like agriculture where you're doing like heavy tilling and depleting the soils. There's also another way in which regenerative is used in our industry, which is like natural regeneration. So the idea is, hey, we'll plant 100 trees here, and what we really expect to happen is that those trees will end up creating seeds. Those seeds will go back into the ground, and now it's sort of a self-perpetuating system. This is something you don't typically see from a timber plantation or a monoculture, right? You plant a timber tree and they're planted in these rows, and then they're all cut down. They don't create new trees underneath them. The reason why that doesn't happen is because it doesn't have all of the understory necessary. So you need shrubs, you need grasses, you need all those kinds of things to create that ecosystem that bring bugs and worms and birds, right? That birds will eat the seeds and they'll spread those seeds to other areas. And so you don't see that in a timber or monoculture plantation, but you do see that in a native forest. This is called assisted natural generation as one of the practices in which you can do this intentionally. In forestry, and we do have some projects that use that by intention to say, hey, we're going to plant a minority of trees here. We're actually going to let nature restore the rest of it for us. And this is how we think that that's going to model out. So yes, I mean, at least in those two ways, the projects are very regenerative.
Super smart. Wow. Just a note to the group, if you raise your hand and want to speak, we don't have that turned on. So please write your question in to Q&A or chat box. Carry on. Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, no problem. Kind of mentioned this already. One of the things to call out is that if you compare the traditional carbon project today, they're using about 1 to 7 species, so not very biodiverse. Right? We talked about monoculture plantations. The vast majority of them are monoculture or some sort of like timber plantation that they oftentimes expect to cut down at the end of the project, at the end of the 30-year life. Our projects are truly biodiverse native, right? So they're 10 to 50 species, sometimes more in our projects. And this is kind of what gets to Alfie's question about how do you make sure that these are regenerative and outlive any one of us. Worth also noting, this is something that's changed, I would say, in the last year, but the standards in which you register carbon projects, the demand from corporations actually demand this type of stuff, right? So they demand native projects now. The requirements are actually that it's got to be at least 50%, 51% native species. So not a high bar per se. We'd love to see it to be 100, but they're actually starting to trend in this way where they're not allowing just pure monoculture plantations anymore. And again, this is something that Terraformation's been on from the very beginning of the company. It's great to see the rest of the market catch up. And so we're lucky to find ourselves a little bit ahead of the curve here. And then when we start thinking about returns, so this is the way in which we see carbon sequestration. So one of the things about our business model is that trees sequester very little carbon, when they're small. Call it around the 15 to 25 year mark. That's when they really start to sequester the most amount of carbon, right? As the tree gets bigger and bigger. And so what that means is for these projects, they require a lot of CapEx up front. 5, 10, $20 million in some cases. But that pays back over this, call it like 15 to 25 year period. And then over the full 40 years of the project life cycle, you sort of get these dividends that come out as this carbon sequestered, and you monetize that. You can also sell this carbon as kind of a future. We call it a forward contract. So you might put money into a project as CapEx, and then call it a year or 2 years in, you can sell those carbon rights to a corporation like a Microsoft who'll pay $70 or $80 a ton. And your development cost might have just been, call it, $10 or $15. So that's one of the ways in which we work out these structural issues with the capital. But it's worth calling out that like this is a very capital intensive business, but over time, I mean, the trees really just take care of themselves. We do not need to put that much more money into maintenance and OpEx. It really just does take care of itself. This is a deep dive. So this is one of our projects in Ghana. So we're restoring 13 million mangroves on deforested land. This is the coast of Ghana. It's a lagoon called Kita Lagoon. And this project takes about $5 million in CapEx. It's going to sequester about 1 million tons of CO2. And, it'll return essentially, we'll take $5 million and through a mix of corporate forward purchases, grant programs, and other investments, turn that $5 million into about $30 million of revenue.
Over what time period?
So the vast majority of it will come probably in the first, call it 5 or 10 years. And this is through mainly forward purchases. So we actually just completed one about a month ago. We sold 15,000 tons at just under $50 per ton. And so it's about $750,000. And that'll cover, it ends up being like a very small percentage, maybe like 2% of the overall carbon out of the project, but covers, what is that? Like 20% of the CapEx for the project. So if we can do stuff like that, it really depends on the price that you can get. But if you can sell your carbon at a really high price, use that to finance the CapEx, you can actually reserve a lot of it for, call it what's called spot purchases, but future purchases. So it's kind of this balance between how much of your lunch do you want to sell, forward versus how much do you want to retain, and then maximize that profit, call it on the spot market.
It's kind of like selling film rights abroad or monetizing the net present value of a future revenue stream on something, right? Some recurring revenue thing, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the right balance, the way to think about it.
Yeah. Is in the sale is only the carbon credits. It's not the revenue, because there's really no revenue except for the carbon credits that are generated from the plants, the trees, unless there's fruit or something like that. Is that fair to say?
That's right. There are some projects that'll generate other types of revenue, not on this one, but there might be a project that has, again, sustainable timber, where they'll have a timber market that they'll sell into in Latin America, or they'll grow cocoa or coffee, and sell that to a distributor in the area like Nestle or something. And that would be additional revenues that would come even earlier into the project, typically within the first 5 or so years, or 10 years. And then the carbon revenue is meant to be kind of this, you can kind of think it more like a dividend, right? You can forward sell that dividend to somebody else, or you can sort of take it as a long-term distribution over a 40-year period.
Yeah. I think of all kinds of things to do with the forward contracts. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, there's some very cool financial engineering here, which actually leads me to the maybe last slide that I've got. I'd say the opportunities at Terraformation that we're looking for partnership on, one are individual projects. And so we've got a number of projects like this one in Ghana. Fantastic teams, have gone through our accelerator. We've known them for a couple of years now and just seen them do fantastic work. And again, just last month, we had that validated from a third-party buyer who gave a far above market price. And we've been, publicizing the details of that and really want to move the space forward and get people to value nature. But we're starting to see that happen now, I think, in the world as companies make their commitments. Also, as they look towards 2030 and their net zero commitments there, we're seeing a lot of people start to raise their hand. One thing to note too, if you saw the slide, right, it takes about 5 years for a reforestation project to go from planting to the point at which it's issuing carbon credits. And if you're a corporation, and you need to do the math between now and your 2030 goal, you have to make an investment now. You have to make an investment now, maybe at the latest next year, if you want to get carbon credits for your 2030 commitment. And so what's happening is there's I would say like a real scramble for companies who want to get these very rare or limited second generation credits and try to get them at a reasonable price. And so prices are going up very high right now, which makes it even more important, I think, that people invest in projects today. So we've got individual projects right now that have gone through our accelerator at different stages. If you're interested in investing in an individual project and getting some exposure to a different kind of asset or different type of thing, that's one opportunity. The second is that we've started to see, this work out enough times through our accelerator, this accelerator model. Right? I think we're starting to get a lot of conviction around it. And similarly, to in the shoes of Y Combinator, it makes sense for us to set up a fund. And so that's something we're still kind of thinking through and starting to structure, but it's something to look forward to, I think, at Terraformation. If that's something you're interested in learning about, happy to chat with you about that too. But it just makes sense for us to really try to concentrate capital when we know these projects the best, rather than trying to go to outside funding and just take them a little bit further. Yeah,
it totally makes sense. Just a note for the group that may have missed it, there's been $70 million so far raised for Terraformation, and then the idea of the fund is something that they're, as Jonathan said, thinking about doing to make it easier for people to invest on the back of their knowledge. I think that's probably a fair way to say it. And can we just jump back to the 2 slides about the founders and the investors? Because it's really interesting to see the notable folks on here. We all know who Sam and Max are, and of course, Joe Lonsdale from Palantir. And then, I mean, this is a crazy list. Good for you. Wow. Yeah, pretty impressive. Is there when people are buying the forward contracts, or companies buying the forward contracts for the carbon credits, it's the carbon credits to offset their carbon use, right? So it's not like, for example, an insurance company suffers from matching their long-term assets and liabilities. So they buy bonds, and they're big buyers of bonds that can match their long liabilities, people living and dying and that sort of thing. Is there a coupon aside from the offset that could be generated from from buying the credits that way?
Not yet. There is some work, I think, being done by like the World Bank and others to put together this idea of a green bond, so that companies could invest in this and get some type of coupon or something like that. But for the most part, this is really for corporates to retire the emissions that they couldn't abate through reductions. And we're always going to have that, right? Like, people wonder if the carbon markets are ever going to go away. Even if we were in a world in which like energy was free, right? I don't know, we're on nuclear or something like that, and energy is completely free, we're always going to emit carbon, right? Just by living, we are emitting carbon. And so there's always going to be a need for offsetting that carbon if we want to take it out of the atmosphere. So yeah, I think honestly, this stuff is just going to be around forever. It's going to be something we as a species just have to live with. And the question is, though, what's the right way in which we go about solving that, and how do we finance it to be something that is affordable by everybody, kind of ubiquitous?
Yeah. Can you share the typical buyers that you're seeing? You don't have to say the names. Are there airlines? Are there people using big data centers? People who or companies, I'm sorry, that are just consuming a lot of power and therefore have a big footprint? Is it that sort of thing you're seeing?
Yeah. So there's 2 sides to this market. There's the compliance market. So oil and gas companies, airlines, all the heavy emitting industries are regulated by that. We are in the voluntary side, although a lot of people expect these markets to merge together. But we see technology companies for sure, I would say, are the most forward thinking about this. Google's been, I think, net zero since 2014. So they've been making investments for a long time. Microsoft's been doing this for a really long time. But pretty much every tech company out there, Meta, Netflix, Salesforce, all of them have been buying offsets for a while now. And but more and more now you start to see some of these larger industries. So Delta Airlines, I would say is like one of the most notable in JetBlue for buying carbon offsets. There was a new regulation now passed where or a policy passed. So now airlines have to buy a certain type of credit. So these are like mangrove projects essentially that they can buy under this framework called Corsia. There aren't that many mangrove projects out there. In fact, I think ours is one of the few, especially on this new methodology, that are available. But it's a quickly changing market, but the trend has been continually towards regulation and policies that incentivize or require corporations to buy carbon offsets. Actually, I just learned recently too, in the shipping industry, so not only are shipping companies required to buy offsets on the voluntary market, but every other supplier that works for them. So you think of like the people operating the forklifts at the docks actually also have to be offsetting their emissions. And all the cranes, like everything to unload the ships at the docks and the ports, all of those also have to be buying offsets. So yeah, it's a really interesting and fascinating space that there's a lot underneath once you start pulling up the rug.
Yeah, there's somebody on the call who's in the business of credentialing the supply chains so they adhere to the ESG requirements, which includes every supplier back. A big corporation, Walmart, buys something, but they can't buy it from somebody unless they can credential what that supplier is, its provenance of the supply chain. And that's become a pretty another constraint for corporations to adhere to from a regulatory perspective, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we saw the same thing happen in the privacy space with software companies where, GDPR or the California ruling, right? The big companies are required to do it because they're the ones that feel the most pain because they're global or regulated, and they push it down to all of their suppliers. We're seeing the same thing happen through Microsoft and the technology companies, but also CPG companies. Think of like a Nestle or a Cargill. Right? They're asking all of their suppliers to now tell them, hey, how are you, meeting these sustainability goals? Because they roll up to the larger organization. So I think you're going to see this sea change happen pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating. Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah,
Really,
thanks for
really
having me.
interesting. We have, let me see, let's see if we can fit another question in here. Can you restore the ancient forests that are now deserts?
Yeah, possibly. So one of the first things that we built, and actually our first site is on Hawaii Island. It's in this area that used to be a native sandalwood forest. Sandalwood is an incense tree, and it was really popular. It's native to Hawaii. It's called Iliahi. Actually, the name of the elementary school that I went to growing up. And through a lot of logging, there was a trade that went between China and Hawaii. They logged that entire area. So it's completely denuded. If you go there, it looks like a complete desert. It's also on the coast, and so it's just whipped by the wind, and it has a really hard time retaining the soils there. That's our first site. And in order to reforest that site, we actually had to start with water. So we built actually what I think is still today one of the largest solar off-grid desalination facilities. So 20 solar panels or so, pumps water out of the ground, has this like essentially a storage shed that does desalination, and it's all done just using clean energy completely off the grid. And that brings water to this area. And now we've actually, over the last couple of years, you can actually see trees from satellites now. You can see the grasses coming back, whereas before it just looked like a complete desert. You can actually see it getting reforested. So I would say, the main thing that we focus on is making sure that we're putting trees where they were supposed to be, but it is possible to reforest areas that have been desertified.
Yeah, that's super interesting because with the wind, some folks underestimate the power of the wind, right? If there's no trees to break the wind, you can almost do nothing, right?
Yeah, that's right. Here, I'm going to put it up on my background here. You can see
Oh,
this.
cool. Let's look at that.
Yeah, there's the solar panels over here, and this is like the
Shed.
the shed with all the desals happening in it. But this is what it looks like when we first started, and now it's completely green.
Wow. Wild. Let's take one more question. Let's see. Have you ever assisted in the development of an industrial hemp?
Nothing in industrial hemp. All of our work is really in
Trees.
native restoration, so we don't typically do anything that's one species.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Well, super interesting. Thanks, Jonathan, for doing this. And Shelley, as always, this is, good pick. Shelley's responsible for selecting these, so nicely done once again.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for building a great company. So
Really, really fascinating. We often talk about a lot of these well-intentioned nonprofits, and they're so underfunded and understaffed and not scaled. And I'm not putting you in that bucket. I'm just saying it's been a challenge, right? And siloed, and it's such a difficult problem. In some ways, people just want to be the one that takes care of it, and so their ego gets in the way, and instead of partnering with each other. But this is super interesting. Yeah, I think really appreciate you coming on, Jonathan. And we'll make sure everybody who's on the call get in touch with you directly and see if they can participate in one of the projects or the fund as it comes to life. That would be awesome. Really appreciate it. Shelley, you want to wrap it up a little bit?
thank you all for joining. We hope to provide more opportunities to share some of Mercury's really cool companies and funds with you all. And yeah, we'll send a follow-up email with a deck and some more information of how to get in contact with myself and my team, as well as continue the conversation with Jonathan. I know that he has some exciting stuff as well planned, maybe in person. So very good to kick that off in your communication with him.
Perfect. Thank you. And Jonathan, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate you being here.
It's been an honor.
We can do it again sometime.
In Hawaii.
In Hawaii. Yeah, next webinar is in Hawaii.
We have a lot of friends that moved to Park City from wherever, New York or California, and a handful of them moved to Hawaii. So it seems to be a trend. Right? Yeah. So again, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining today. And as usual, thank you for sharing. The only thing you can't make more of, and that's your time. Till next time, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.